Hi everybody. In case you weren't able to be with us for our live session, I thought I would record a quick video to talk about the different game design basics that we'll be encountering as we start developing and designing games. The first thing we need to do is understand that there are certain categories or basic types of games. Learn about the aspects of a game or how the games are structured. In future lessons, we're going to be looking at the components of a game. That is, the things that you have to physically create, the creative elements, the music, the characters, the environments, any of that kind of thing that goes into making the game experience more fulfilling. And by the end, we'll have a strong start-to-finish development process that can take you through the development of any type of game. Our first objective is to talk about different categories of games. I'm not talking about mystery versus first-person shooter versus medieval or anything like that. No, we want to take it out even farther. Start with a much higher view of what games are. And there are three different categories. The first, party games. Now, party games might not be the first thing to jump to mind when you start thinking about games, but party games are in fact a very strong and widespread category. Party games include things like conversation games, guessing games, think charades or Pictionary, but can also include games that are group games done outside, like tag or hide and seek. A lot of these types of games are those that involve larger groups of people, sometimes teams, sometimes free-for-all, but they are games that include any sort of interaction, and they don't necessarily involve props or game pieces. Next, we have tabletop games. And up until we started really seeing the onslaught of computer and video games back in the 90s and since then, tabletop games were the games of choice. These are things like board games and card games, dice games, tile games like Mahjong, strategy games, and role-playing games. All sorts of different things can fall under this. Things like crossword puzzles, actual puzzles, anything like that you might use a physical set, whether it's a board, a deck of cards, certain equipment that you would sit down and play together, even pencil and paper, like tic-tac-toe. Next, we have technology games, and these are the ones that really stand out to most of us. When we think games, we think arcade games, computer games, console games, handheld games, or mobile games. Things that you actually need to be plugged in for, whether it is on a computer screen, a handheld or mobile device, or you actually go to an arcade for. Anything that involves programming can fall under the technology games category. Now, as we look at these, you'll find that there are some games that might cross over. For example, I know I've played things like Scrabble, a tabletop game, on the computer, which makes it a technology game. And there are all sorts of different things, like Pictionary can be both a party game or a desktop or a tabletop game. So there's a lot of fluidity between these categories, but understand there are basics to these. And it's often the first step in game development to figure out what type of game, what category are you going to create. This is a very limited list, of course, of the different genres or types of games. And they can also fall under different categories. I won't read through all these now, but you can certainly see how a game like Tag could be considered a multiplayer game, even though it's a party game. But also, for sure, there are lots of technology games that are also multiplayer. Games like parlor games, as we've talked about already, can be done both as tabletop or technology games as well. Travel games, which you might play in the car on a road trip, can be a party game, but could also be a tabletop game, or certain travel trivia and that sort of thing can be found in technology games as well. But first, once we know what type of game and what category of game we're going to create, let's look at the different aspects of a game or its structure. How does the game work? That's the most important question. Before you start designing anything, you need to develop the basic rules and structure that make this game happen. So, what are the rules? You'll notice with any board game or card game or any computer game or video game for that matter, they will have a set amount of rules that you have to follow. Whether that means that you have a certain amount of time to play, you have to follow certain steps to get from point A to point B. They might define which way the game plays, whether it's, one person, starts and then it goes around the circle for a board game, or you start in a certain place. You have to figure out the rules first. How is it set up? Do you define the world that the game takes place in? Do you have a board that sets up the proper path through the game? Who are your players? Is there age limitations? Is it E for everyone, T for teen, M for mature? Is it for ages 6 and up? How many players? Is it good for 1? You need 2 players, but no more than 4? What's the actual rules here? That's one of the big things you have to figure out. Is it teams? Are you going to be playing, it's a free-for-all, one person is only out for themselves? Or are you playing with teams? Or is it, some sort of variation on that? This is what we consider the audience. I know in storytelling, we've talked about the audience as being who the actual marketing or advertising is meant for. And in a way, that's true here too. You factor in all of that as well, but also the audience is those actually playing. And so who are you looking for to play the game, and how many at a time? Then, what's the goal? How do you win? What you want to think about for sure is, what's the point? You don't want somebody to get to the end of an adventure only to find that they're just going to sit there at the end. That's no fun. So, how do you win? What's the goal? It has to be something enticing enough to make somebody want to play through the whole thing. And it has to be something big that makes it worth it. And so I always say, and it's been said many times in a number of different contexts, that you have to begin with the end in mind. And I've said this before. Begin with the end in mind so that whatever you do serves that purpose. From how to start the game, to different obstacles along the way, to different advantages along the way. It all has to help the player get to the ending and serve that purpose. Once you know where it's going to end, you'll know how to start it. How do you start in a board game can come down to, okay, if it's, everybody rolls the dice, whoever has the highest number goes first. Sometimes it's whoever's the oldest or whoever's the youngest or something like that. But you have to figure out how you start. You can't just show up and get going. You have to have a beginning point. Does everybody start at go in Monopoly? Right. You have to figure that stuff out. Of course, once you figure out how it starts, what happens next? Does everybody start at the same time, or is it one at a time? Is the person who starts in a game of poker, the dealer deals and the person to the left starts and it goes around clockwise. Okay, that's good. Good stuff to know. There's also a set number of times around you go in, say, poker, for example, before you actually lay down your cards and see who's won the round. Once you know how things are going to start moving, what can we encounter along the way? Do you earn points for things and have points taken away? Do you receive advantages like upgrades in your weapons or tools? Do you see disadvantages like in Monopoly and having to be sent to jail? What are the things that make your game interesting? What gives people an incentive to keep moving on? What can they avoid? What can they work towards? What is it that makes your game a challenge? Because a game that's too easy is not going to be fun. It has to be a challenging game so that you work harder next time and you want to keep playing. You want to keep coming back to it. So I've taken this structure and I've applied it a bit to Monopoly. So how do you play? Well, each player selects a game piece. Everyone's given an equal amount of money. And then you roll the dice to see who goes first. Highest number goes first, and the plate continues to the left. So right here, we're already starting to see some of the rules play out, but also a way to kind of set it up so that everyone starts equally. If you don't start on an equal footing with everyone around you, then that adds to more conflict. And as we all know, Monopoly has enough conflict as it is. Then we start talking about the flow of the game, like what happens. Once you start, you have a few things that you run into. So if you land on a property, you have to buy it or pay rent. If you land on chance or community chest, you have to pick up a card and then do what the card says. Advantages and disadvantages. And in this case, money is points. So if you land on go to jail, you have to go to jail until you pay a price or roll double. These are all variations on the house rules because everybody plays Monopoly a little different. And then if you pass go, you collect $200. This is all about advantages and points and incentives and also the flow of the game. And of course, how does it end? Whoever has the most money or property wins. So you have your goal. Pretty straightforward. So for your assignment, you have to choose a physical board game if you have one, or you can choose a digital board game if you don't have a physical one. But it has to be a board game. At least it should. I know a few people have had a hard time finding board games and have picked card games, but we're going to be dealing with card games later on in the class. So please try and find a board game of some kind. So in Google Classroom, once you play the game, we want you to describe the genre of the game. What are its general rules? How do you set it up? And who are your players? And how does it flow? That sort of thing. All of these things that are listed from the previous slides. Talk about points, advantages, and disadvantages. And then how do you start or win? What's the goal? The reason I want you to play the game as you're making your analysis is that, sure, you could read the rules, come up with a good list here, and answer all the questions. But there's a lot more that goes into a game beyond what just the rules say. We all play a slightly different way. There are things that you might pick up, little nuances here and there that you only get from when you're playing. So please play the game, even if it's only for a few minutes, so that you can get a sense for how it actually works. So what's next? After our initial session, we had a chance to actually have office hours to work through some of the questions that you might have had based on our initial lesson. So during that time, it was for checking in to help find out what it is that you might have missed, some clarification, and also to give me an idea of what you're working on so that we can move forward, make sure that you're on track. On Wednesday, we're all going to report back. Basically, you're going to share what games you played and what your analysis is. It's not so much a presentation, so don't get worried about it. Just take a minute to talk about your game and what it is you found. Then on Thursday, we're going to have a follow-up session, which basically takes everything that we've talked about this week and follow it up with a Kahoot or a Nearpod quiz, just to talk about the week's concepts. Now, this will be graded. However, it's not going to be such a big major part like a full-on quiz grade. So make sure you are in the session for that so that you can get as much out of it as possible and get the credit you deserve. That's it for this week. So make sure you're following through with our lessons. Make sure that you are working through your assignments and turning them in and actually participating. I know this is a difficult time for everyone, and things are kind of strange, as far as motivation goes and timing goes. But as you go through, please make sure that you're participating. This stuff does matter. It's actually what a lot of you have come to the class for, to focus on gaming. So please take part. Be part of this class and this community, and I hope you do well. I'm looking forward to it.